To our final speaker who hit Ireland this morning for the first time, or not Ireland for the first time, but Drogheda for the first time, and we're really delighted she's one of the contributors to the catalogue, and I'm going to welcome her now. I'm just going to move the slide here. Jill Carey is Emeritus Professor of Art History at the Open University and Visiting Professor of Art History at the Birkbeck College University of London. She has published widely on 18th century and modern and contemporary art and has a special interest in women's practice and gender relations. She also writes on installation and performance art, focusing on themes of gender, identity and global art histories in the UK, Ireland, Europe and beyond. Her books include Paula Modison Becker, Her Life and Work, The Women's Press 1979, Women Artists in the Parisian Avant-Garde, Modernism and Feminine Art 1900 to the late 1920s, Manchester University Press 1995, Gender and Art, Yale University Press 1999, Difference and Excess in Contemporary Art, The Visibility of Women's Practice, Blackwell's 2003, Themes in Contemporary Art, Yale University Press 2004, Spectacular Flirtations, Viewing the Actress in British Art, 1768.
Don't worry.
Yes, 1820, Yale University Press. Her curated exhibitions include The First Actresses, Nell Gwynn, to Sarah Siddons at the National Portrait Gallery, London, 2011 to 2012. Relationships Between Gender and Home, featured in her book Playing at Home, The House and Contemporary Art Reaction Books, 2013, and catalogue essay for the Women House, Paris and Washington, 2017 to 2018. Her forthcoming book in this year considers different ways in which contemporary artists have explored the island theme, Islands in Contemporary Art, Reaction Press 2020. Please welcome to the stage, Jill Carey. Thank you.
I want to start by saying how pleased I am to be here and what fantastic exhibition this is for someone like me who works quite broadly across kind of global feminisms. Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Fiona, for asking me. Fiona also said that I should start by telling a bit about, as we say, my subject position. She said everyone's going to ask you where you're from, because I'm clearly not Irish. Well, I kind of am. I want you to know right from the beginning that my interest in Irish art comes from the fact that I have a paternal grandmother with the name of O'Doherty, can't get much better than that, and a maternal grandfather with the name of Shaw, and I've been trying to find their birth certificates so I can become one of you. But it's tough. That said, I also want to explain that this paper, hang on, okay, it came up. It builds on or relates to some of the fascinating points that Fiona made in hers, and it also looks quite broadly at sort of iconographies of feminism, at particularly goddess and mythical women theme, and this theme that Fiona has outlined so brilliantly in her essay about the way in which feminism or feminisms, contemporary feminisms, are in dialogue with the past, and the politics of embodiment as a kind of crucial issue is a big kind of amorphous theme that runs throughout what I'm saying. I am going to start by taking you away from Ireland. There are notices at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty telling the tourist that the view from the bottom of her pedestal is the best, and that the view from the top, from inside her seven-pointed crown, is restricted. Yet most people still clamber up to the top of her enormous body to peer out of small, grimy windows. They choose to be soaring above Manhattan, penetrating her body until they are literally inside her head. Her corporeal form thus enables a spectacular participatory performance inside a hugely symbolic female body, hollowed out to enable the people to feel that they are part of her. Unveiled, as most of you will know, in 1886, and 150 feet high, Liberty is a giant, a recognizable female colossus that stands for so much more than her material sculptural form. So the Statue of Liberty has been used to symbolize so much: freedom understood as power, the American dream, a determination to be rich and powerful, and of course it's been used to legitimize political campaigns, even give them moral dignity. I couldn't resist this famous, how the cipher now turns up on every kind of American souvenir and brand identity, from clothes, makeup, children's books, film logos, to Mae West's famous poster publicity shot from the 1970s for Mike Sand's comedy Myra Breckenridge. And I couldn't resist the other image of Mae West on the theme of women assuming roles, which of course is what I'm talking about. I used to be Snow White. But as Marina Warner pointed out back in the 1980s, it was already getting increasingly difficult to use liberty, you can see what's coming, for serious causes without irony. I quote, "She identifies the city and by extension the nation, and she provides a benchmark of an ideal few people still believe has been upheld or will ever be fulfilled. How free were American women at the time of her construction, we might ask? And of course, she holds a further ironic significance in the context of this conference today. She personified the migrants' welcome, the symbol of hope, justice and freedom for so many Irish immigrants sailing into New York in the late 19th century and thereafter. And as this exhibition demonstrates, Irish culture was already full of some all too visible allegorical and symbolic women who stayed put. And on the immigration theme, I couldn't resist this modern cartoon that has regendered liberty and her ironic significance. A powerful cartoon, I think. The female body is used in the New York statue as a carrier of several powerful allegories. Warner writes again, "No visitor looking up at the Statue of Liberty imagines her appearance as a sign that women have enjoyed privileged access to freedom in the United States then or now, or that society has accorded her such a high place in its symbolism, ever believed that to be the case. As is now well established, throughout ancient and modern history, women's bodies have been used allegorically, quite simply to create other speech, from the Latin allos or other. Allegory is a form of metaphor. In visual terms, it uses speech or imagery to contain another layer of meaning, a deliberate double intention. Given this, the allegorical nature of this imagery carries huge potential for the suggestion of irony, enigma, or confusion. And this is a feature, I think, provocatively exploited by some of the women artists exhibiting in this exhibition. They've reappropriated various goddess themes and their frequent transformation into passive agents or threatening witch-like figures, thereby revealing and exposing some of their hollow or unstable allegorical meanings. And I drew on again another cartoon that seems to me to represent rather well justice and liberty are joining together in proclaiming Me Too. In other words, they are aware of their own exploitation. So perhaps the greatest irony in the recurrent use of statues of the female body in Western and other cultures is that their didactic allegorical status, for example, liberty, justice, the liberal arts, virtue, Marianne of the French Republic, Britannia, the Catholic Madonna, and so on, is often in inverse relation to the emancipation and public achievements of actual contemporary women. All too often, they are rooted in a patriarchal discourse, often sexualized, as this cartoon nicely suggests, as liberty and justice clearly agree. Women's bodies have often been popular vessels for the communication of various moral and abstract ideas, moral, political, cultural, and so on. They are all too often emblematic bodies for rent. Of course, classical Greek and Roman culture offered a whole pantheon of supposedly powerful goddesses for representation in a society in which women were largely unenfranchised. Athena for wisdom, Nike victory, Diana the huntress, Juno, patron goddess of the Roman Empire, and so on. And needless to say, Catholic culture, and Irish culture in particular, has persistently represented and celebrated, I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, you know about it, has persistently represented and celebrated the cult of the Madonna, alongside a deep-rooted fear of and resistance to women's sexual, political, and religious emancipation. And I thought it's worth mentioning Patricia Hurl's nicely and ironically reappropriated Madonna here, anonymous, desentimentalized and expressionist Madonna, and Jessie Jones, whose transgressive giant witch in Tremble, Tremble has turned her into a disruptive feminist archetype. So another profoundly gendered symbolic body, Mother Island, has perhaps a more complicated history of visual representation, as I suggest later. The myth of Mother Island, who, as you all know only too well, is a kind of surrogate goddess, an amalgam of various Celtic and Catholic fantasies, including Danu, who's represented rather grotesquely in that work over there on the left. And most of you will recognise the W.B. Yeats play on the right, the Kathleen Lee Houlihan. I think that was written in 1907 or thereabouts. This has been, this kind of imagery and the kind of mythical stories attached to it has been subject to some intense interrogation and exploration by feminists and psychoanalysts, among others. The idea of Island as woman, variously personified as my dark Rosaline, Kathleen Lee Houlihan, Mother Eyre, and so on, presents an imaginary romantic vision of the nation as both a protected mother and as a mother in need of protection. And as Linda Clark and many others have pointed out, the idea of Ireland as mother, often tied to nature and or the church, has been so effective that it is entrenched in those stereotypical roles for women and helped to create a state structure and culture in Ireland, and indeed an Irish constitution, whereby men have occupied the political role of fighting for the rights of Ireland on women's behalf, as opposed to women having real agency in that fight. Not to mention sexual and gynecological constraints, and of course, very moving talk that we've just had on the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, has shown us how artists have played a strategic role in rethinking and reclaiming our relationships with women's bodies. Female allegory, often in the form of monuments in public places, has flourished then in Irish, European, and American cultures that claim various forms of democratic freedom. But, like the Statue of Liberty and Mother Island, they are all replete with massive contradictions, ironies and ambiguities, an aspect which, along with the artists that I've been looking at, I'm trying to explore here. Women's bodies continue to present artists with a literal and symbolic resource for exploring themes of misogyny and associated cultural myths. They are no longer those empty bodies for rent, thank goodness, but rather reappropriated for more ambiguous and fluid meanings, as I think this exhibition so vividly demonstrates. That said, critical representations of the female body, dominant female archetypes, and women's histories that are evoked in and way beyond Ireland are, of course, shifting, complex, multifaceted, and often elliptical. And this takes us back to Fiona's point about some of the complex temporalities that, as feminist art historians, we are dealing with. Now, there's another aspect of the Statue of Liberty that resonates for this exhibition. Visitors are invited to explore the inside of this allegorical body, to penetrate her inner tissues and rise above New York. It's apparently 354 steps. I'm sure there's someone in the room who's done it. That's the equivalent of about 20 stories. Yet the inside of Liberty's body is rather different to some of those abject, fluid, hybrid, even intestinal, as someone pointed out, bodies explored in this exhibition. Her insides reveal the artifice of her external skin. The copper sheets and cast iron struts appear mechanical and functional. Crisscrossing struts and undulating forms of copper sheets suggest the gigantic but carefully controlled contours of her body. There's nothing abject about this body. Liberty, then, is very much a body for rent, a body conceived intentionally without ambiguity. Given this status as cipher, it shouldn't surprise us that powerful goddess figures from antiquity slip easily into witch-like or more threatening figures, Medusa, Cassandra, Pandora, and so on. And since the 1980s, as this exhibition shows us, new generations of Irish women artists have invigorated debates about these archetypes, stretching them and their various corporeal incarnations and represented experiences. Artists such as Alice Maher, Jessie Jones, Dorothy Cross, among many others, have each revisualized aspects of the Medusa myth, deploying hybrid, multi-limbed body imagery that conjures up a destabilizing and abject femininity. And of course, Alice Maher's work has been mentioned a lot here, but she's used quite a lot of mythical figures in her work, Cassandra's necklace, Hecate, and so on. Dorothy crosses ubiquitous jellyfish, swims across the screen as Medusae in this work that she showed in the Royal Academy exhibition in 2019. And of course we've already looked extensively at Louise Walsh's snakes that remind us of the ubiquity of the snake, the key theme in the Medusa and goddess mythology. So the Highlands exhibition then vividly demonstrates these fluid and elliptical visual languages adopted by women artists working in both Irish, that is Northern Irish and the Republic, and I think transnational contexts, informed by gender issues that have helped to drive global feminisms. Now, I've argued that some of the most powerful work by these artists is both enmeshed within its own traumatic political and religious histories in Ireland, while also engaging with cultural concerns and deconstructive strategies that have enriched recent feminist practice within the visual arts. And this is where Fiona's discussion and arguments about both working and interpreting across time, the idea of feminist temporalities, is so relevant. Works crossing different temporal zones and geographical spaces can, of course, be subject to shifting meanings. That said, witches, goddesses, and uncomfortable feminine archetypes have been reappropriated by some of the best-known feminist artists working in Europe and the USA and beyond over the last 4 or 5 decades. Carolee Schneemann's famous eye-body transformative actions famously and grotesquely uses the snake motif, as does Cindy Sherman with her performative self-portrait as a kind of Medusa. And interestingly, last weekend I happened to be at a wonderful exhibition at Pallant House in Chichester, back in England now, where there's an exhibition called Radical Women. And an artist whose work I think has not been properly explored in recent, perhaps feminist art history, has a small display there next to the display of some of Jessica Dismore and some earlier artists. And I came across her snake lady and immediately got my iPhone out, in that she is one of many pop artists, I think, who were also, or post-pop we might say, who were also exploring feminine, goddess-type archetypes. And she actually describes this as a project in which she was trying to create a kind of Medusa figure, and she spent months looking for mock snakeskin fabrics in order to create this rather disarming and sort of wriggling figure. She plays on this imagery that some of these other artists I've been discussing play on, of the slimy, writhing, wriggling, threatening object that is the snake, that has so often been conflated with notions of femininity and female goddesses. Now, in discussing cross-generational and internal exchange between these artists, influence is perhaps too loaded a word. It's a word that us art historians have to try and be very cautious about. But I prefer to use a term coined by Marsha Miskimen, a term that she uses the term a cosmopolitan imagination. And this relates to things that Fiona was talking about and the idea of woman's time, the sort of Christeva idea. She talks about a vital form of feminist artist expression that crosses natural boundaries and temporal zones and can change the way that we engage with the world around us, that as women practitioners, we engage with certain themes that we feel very intensely, and we try to find kind of aesthetic outlets. So this is a notion that I find is very vivid and helps us to represent these feminist temporalities that we're seeking to place in a kind of non-linear way. In my catalogue essay, I cite Silvia Frederici's work on the history of the persecution of the witch. She talks extensively about the kind of powerful cultural misogyny that has haunted some of those horrific prosecutions and bodily injuries inflicted upon so-called witches, including stonings, dismemberment, burnings, and so on.
Punishments always took the form of visceral corporeal injuries. Evil was thought to be directly symbolised through this corrupt female body. Witches were perceived as sexually depraved, immoral or promiscuous, a threat to patriarchal control. It's hardly surprising then that witches, along with goddesses, and they are a form of goddess in a sense, have been reconceived by so many feminist artists to have an ironic contemporary relevance. You'll all recognise this, and especially the artist. Jessie Jones's powerful film installation Tremble, Tremble, which was commissioned for the Irish Pavilion at the 57th Venice Biennale of 2017. And you'll all know, I'm sure, that her title was inspired by the Italian wages for housework movement of the 1970s, when women chanted, "Tremble, tremble, the witches have returned." Jones turns to the witch, and a giant witch at that, as a potentially disruptive feminist archetype, with a visceral performance by Alwyn Ferreri as Temperance Lloyd, who was, of course, one of the three witches tried and executed in Devon in 1682. In a different and contemporary vein, Breda Lynch's cyanotype digital print, which, oh, that's another view from your installation, Jessie, sorry. Breda Lynch's cyanotype digital print, which reworks photographs of recent feminist activism, which is written over the original photographic image taken from a protest march and displaying banners proclaiming "No fascist witch hunt" and "Witches for Black Lives." Again, celebrating a previously feared trope of women's history and sexuality. And other daunting mythical images of women are also revisited in Jessie Jones' vocabulary of motifs, as in, and I'm very grateful to her here because I've had privileged access to this work, in her 12-headed Sheila Nagig, which is displayed there, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Shown in her Tremble, Tremble show at the Guggenheim Bilbao last year. Sheila Nagig's are quasi-erotic and overtly grotesque, medieval fertility figures found in carved stone in Norman and Romanesque churches in Ireland and Britain. They generally follow the same form. The squatting Sheila holds open her oversized vulva, inviting the viewer to enter the inside of her body. This seems to be another deliberate corporeal conflation of the inside and outside of the woman's body. The prevalence of these images in Ireland, where she derives, at least partly, I think, from the Celtic goddess trinity of Maiden, Mother, Hurl, adds to the complicated local significance of this history of visual representations of sexualized women. And Jones's project was also intended to raise the issue of the appropriated colonial object. The one that she works from is an Irish, as you can see, from an Irish one from County Westmeath that is currently in the British Museum. And I hope I've got this right, Jessie. This is reconceived in her work through digital re-imaging. It was then cast in wax, mimicking the effects of carved stone. But the figure of the Sheila Nagig also became a widely adopted feminist icon in America and Europe in the 1980s, influencing, for example, the work of Kiki Smith and Nancy Sparrow. For both these artists, the Sheila exhibited the power of female sexuality, perhaps evoking, as John Bird has suggested, an aspect of the Freudian uncanny in the depiction of the threat of what we call unhomely, unheimlich, or sexualized femininity. For Freud, and I'm sure you all know this too, the mother can become unheimlich, or uncanny, through culture's repression of her sexual body, which represents a threatening or engulfing femininity. As in Sparrow's line of Sheila's in Chorus Line of 1985, Jones reclaims this imagery for a provocative art practice that uses repetition and encourages multiple meanings. A circle of Sheilas with displayed genitalia appear to dance mischievously on the gallery display shelf. Inside the female body, then, can be a threatening, abject place, a visceral universe in which slimy, enigmatic forms intermingle and metamorphose, and sometimes appear to seep out. And the closeness of the natural and corporeal world has also consistently informed the imaginative transformations explored by many women artists exhibiting here. I felt I didn't need to name these because they're all so famous. But since the late 1980s and 90s, Jones, Maher, Cross, Sarah Browne, Rachel Fallon, Louise Walsh, and many others have in different ways been using natural materials and references to evoke a range of corporeal and sexual images, mocking expected tactile and gendered associations. Cross's playful, phallic-shaped shark lady, there on the left, in a ball dress of 1988, or virgin shroud in cowhide, or Maher's famous bee dress and berry dress deploy sculptural methods, that's casting or making, to reconceive both nature and a recognised sign of femininity, the dress. And of course you're all familiar with this stuff. Maher's mask of snails and necklace of tongues, reenacted by Amanda Coogan, not to mention her mermaids and other hybrid forms, Cross's repeated use of sharks, udders, cowhide, jellyfish or crabs, Browne's octopus or Walsh's snakes, provoke the viewer to perceive challenging transformations, haptic experiences and bodily metaphors. Are we inside or outside the ubiquitous body? Moreover, the powerful elision of woman and nature and Mother Island is mischievously punctured by such slippery transformations. In her catalogue essay, Sarah Kelleher cites Julia Kristeva's famous theory of the abject in Powers of Horror, published in 1980. And there is little doubt that the excessive, slimy forms explored by many of these Irish artists could be seen to exemplify a notion of abjection, a cultural tendency to see female embodiment and to sort of affirm it, if you like, and all its waste matter as abject, echoing, of course, the disturbingly revealed inner darkness of the Sheila Nagui. But acts of metamorphosis involved can carry, I'm not quite there yet, can carry iconoclastic meanings. I'm going to quote Marina Warner again in something she wrote on Dorothy Cross, and she uses a very useful term from the surrealist writer Georges Bataille, who wrote in 1929, metamorphic art can reconfigure the amphiform, an inchoate or shapeless thing, hitherto scandalously formless, can cast off its stigma to project a new concept of form itself. This approach can be political, feminist, and anti-imperialist, as it transforms those formerly despised and rejected low-life forms, insect corpses, abject functions, processes, shapes, and creatures. So as women's bodies morph into reptilian or fish-like hybrids, they can be reclaimed, like mermaids, for alternative femininities, perhaps a feminist film. Finally, I want to finish this paper by trying to tie this topic into my current research project, which is this book on islands in contemporary art. That's Islands, I-S-L-A-N-D-S. It explores the many ways in which contemporary artists have engaged with the island theme as metaphor, art project, and so on. I write about floating islands, tourist islands, disappearing islands, island detentions, and it raises, of course, issues of identity, climate change, migration, nationalism, colonialism. I've got to get this book finished. And they are all vividly summed up by my project. But Mother Island as an island is something I've been looking at in the last few months. Back in 1976, Edna O'Brien, one of my favourite writers, wrote an evocative study of the tales and myths that have formed the idea of Mother Island. The book opens as follows. Ireland has always been a woman, a womb, a cave, a cow, a Rosaline, a sow, a bride, a harlot, and of course the gaunt hag of beer. Originally a land of woods and thickets, such as Orpheus had seen when prescribing the voyage of Jason, through a misted atmosphere. She is thought to have known invasion from the time when the Ice Age ended and the improving climate allowed deer to throng her forests. These infiltrations have been told and fabricated by men, and by mediums who describe the violation of her body and soul. Ireland has always been God-ridden. And I put two tourist pictures of the Emerald Isle there just to make the point. So Ireland's island body then has been perpetually plundered and violated by those who came from overseas. The misty iconography of Mother Island can be found, interestingly, in the imagery of many of the covers of O'Brien's books.
Green is always there somewhere, and I love the one for Wild Decembers where this misty sort of mother figure looms against the green Irish background, and I couldn't resist the juxtaposition with Cathy Prendergast, who imaginatively exploits that juxtaposition, this series from her 1985, in which both male and female bodies seem to morph into these incoherent, watery forms, and in which the emergence of green patterns reminds us of the perpetual slippage between ideas of nature, landscape, and the female body. The idea, and Irish culture, of course, is steeped in island tales and metaphors. The idea of island, the separate island, that has consistently resisted the bullying English, is often tied to some deep-seated unconscious sense of Ireland as a kind of virgin mother, and of course, another Madonna. Back in 1922, the psychoanalyst Ernest Jones had already emphasised in Irish mythological culture a powerful identification of the native land or island with the Virgin Mother. It's not uncommon to identify a native land with a woman who's both virginal and maternal, as in Britannia, Columbia, Germania, and so on. But Jones and others have argued that for Ireland, these maternal complexes are exceptionally strong, reinforced perhaps by her history of being invaded and plundered. The plundered island is, as Edna O'Brien reminds us, a woman, a mother, and a womb. It's also a ravaged womb that perpetually seeks to recover. Cormac Gallagher has commented on Jones' analysis, arguing, the idea of the existence of a marvellous island in which all desires will be satisfied is widespread in Irish mythology. This idea of an island paradise is also linked to womb fantasies with unconscious feelings, as Jones puts it, about birth, death, and mother. I have lots of work still to do, and I've been looking at various Irish projects off the west coast of Ireland, around islands. But I have always been aware that, or one point that I should make is that island mythologies have historically been largely dominated by men and male stories. Basically, island mythologies and legends are often linked to tales of rugged and brave masculinity. Robinson Crusoe, Lord of the Flies, Treasure Island, and so on. Survival stories that mirror colonial fantasies about controlling and possessing an island. That's why it was a pleasure to come across Pauline Cummins' work, which is, of course, indirectly about the island of Arran, which gives this gendered association an ironic twist. An Arran sweater made by a woman for a man. An Arran Islander, one presumes. It becomes a decorative object with a female sexual desire woven into it. Finally, I got a bit carried away, and as a kind of creative conclusion, I created my own kind of Arran sweater PowerPoint collage against Cummins' background. A reimagined island masculinity overlaid with various reappropriated images of mythical women that might be absorbed into the symbolic body of Mother Island. These are, as I've suggested, a far cry from my starting point, the highly controlled, didactic metal body of the Statue of Liberty, or even of Mother Island. They are rather ironic, fluid, ambiguous, mischievous, slippery transformations, disrupting sexual norms, and working across time. They are powerful ciphers, I believe, for a reconceived femininity for both Ireland and beyond. Thank you.